Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Yeah, Ken was right about a little luck. Welcome everyone to Nightlights Part 2. Don't forget about the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship webinar this weekend. The presidential debate was scheduled to detract from our guests' information about government UFO cover-ups. It was playing that way. Okay, last week was a really fun show. It's nice working with hosts from other networks. Results in new perspectives. Craig Ansell from the Three Beards podcast has been captivated by the Shakespeare authorship controversy and jumped at the chance of getting into a more detailed discussion with Kathleen. It's a small community of radio hosts, and it's a great feeling to have a productive collaboration. It's like when George Harrison brought in Eric Clapton to work on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, or Jeff Beck brings in Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones as a Yardbirds reunion, and they had Keith Moon and the Stones' Nicky Hopkins for Beck's Bolero, which was an early heavy metal nucleus of Led Zeppelin, as well as being a classic rock instrumental. So something different and unexpected emerged. Those combining of networks can present positive results. I've seen some networks where they just prefer to be homogenous and only presenting the same points of view from the same people, and it really doesn't attract new listeners. And I just really want to thank Craig and Kathleen for keeping last week's show moving forward. Great working with them. Okay, tonight's show is something like a family reunion. Our guest, Kathleen Marden, is one of the upper echelon UFO researchers. Kathleen's frequent collaborator, Stanton Friedman, was a regular on Barbara Patrick's show. And the Betty and Barney Hill experience happened about 80 miles from America's Stonehenge, and later on, Dennis's mom and Betty were friends, and Dennis met her a few times. Kathleen's been to America's Stonehenge. I met Kathleen at the 2013 Pittsburgh MUFON conference, and I purchased her the Alien Abduction Files, which had just come out. And a few weeks later, she was on a show that I was helping out with, and that was the first show I did a you know, took the lead in doing a book review. Since Kathleen is returning as a guest, maybe it wasn't all that bad. When I approached her about it, at least she didn't say, I remember you. There's no way I'm ever going to be a guest with you again. But anyhow, we have all kinds of connections weaved together for this show. And there was another one of our regular Nightlight guests. My older brother, Reverend Michael Carter, is friends with her too. So all of us have some kind of connection to ancient aliens as well. So anyhow, Kathleen, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Good. Oh, fine. I'm glad you're here. I've been looking forward to this show for a long time, and really appreciate you being a guest with us tonight. I think we're probably going to be focusing mainly on fact fiction and flying saucers. The Alien Abduction Files, and some more books. I think we're going to tie together. So I think we have a whole bunch of material to get through, and I'm really amazed with the work that you and your variety of co-authors have published.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and let's see. The premise of fact fiction and flying saucers is examining the concerted effort to debunk ufology, and mainly by the government agencies. Early on in the book, and you also bring it up in Alien Abduction Files, some people who intend to further ufology also discredit it. And, I've dealt with a few people who have these 30-minute long one-sentence stories that start off when, this quasi dream state, and then the bright lights appear, and then the aliens appeared beside the bed, and then this, and then that, and the conclusion is about the experiencer's relationship with God. I'm not doubting that something unusual happened. It's just the presentation becomes so discombobulated. It just doesn't sound believable. And, the person could be influenced by ideas presented in, just say Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I encounter that too with some of the alternative history researchers who are convinced that a couple bumps on some rock slabs or remnants of statues from Atlantis and this narrow, steep valley in southern West Virginia. So we have to look at pareidolia, deluded thinking, poor research. It's not consistent with what Plato wrote about the concentric rings in the ocean. Kathleen, in your fact fiction and flying saucers and the Alien Abduction Files, you do profile some of these people, and they are setting the movement backwards. I was just glad to see a reputable author address some of these issues. What are some of the profiles that you encountered, during your research?
Well, let me say that I've encountered just about any profile that you can think of over the past 30 years. of researching and investigating ET contact with non-human intelligence, and I've come to realize through the social science studies and the psychological studies that there are alternative explanations for this, for some of these things, such as sleep paralysis, but it is up to the individual to determine whether or not they are having sleep paralysis. And I provide the information that they need in order to make this determination. And even on my website, I have an article that people can go to read about sleep paralysis. I can also tell you that on a study, this was a major study of 516 experiencers that the Mutual UFO Network's comprehensive study did, we discovered that a vast majority of individuals who believe they've had contact experiences have actually had sleep paralysis, all of those symptoms. But then we asked, were you awake and moving when these non-human entities came into your environment? And then were you paralyzed? And what we found out was that only 36% of the 516 experiencers had that. But among our Phase 2 abductee group, 60% had waking, conscious observation of non-human entities that came into their environment. So we've worked very, very hard in order to separate different types of experiences out. We found that a lot of people are having plain paranormal contact and are not having alien abduction or ET contact. We have determined that there is a difference. Those who, many people have entities that appear in their environment. Some of these entities are highly positive, and a lot of the people who are having medical problems, people who, for example, there's one that I worked with who is quadriplegic. And after the accident, this individual had this angelic figure who would come into his environment and give him strength to go on.
Wow.
Then on the other side of this, we have highly negative non-human entities who sometimes mimic what we think of as being extraterrestrial beings, and but their modus operandi is very different. They taunt people. They put negative thoughts into people's minds. They might encourage them to commit suicide or to do something bad. So there's that part of it as well. And in my latest book that I don't think we're going to talk about tonight, but it's called Extraterrestrial Contact, What to Do When You've Been Abducted, I've devoted an entire chapter to trying to make these negative interdimensionals stop coming into the human's environment. The other category we have is those individuals who are actually having contact with extraterrestrial beings. Now, the way we can differentiate this is that these extraterrestrial beings act as scientists. They take people to their environment for a specific purpose or purposes. One is for education. Another one is to check their bodies through a medical examination. Of course, we all hear that the objective of all of this is to create hybrids. Some people think to supplant humans. But in our MUFON study, a very small percentage of the 516 people who participated stated that they were part of this hybrid program. So there are other reasons too, but I think that the negative, the frightening, has overplayed because that is what attracts media attention. How horrific this is, how frightening this is. And part of the objective in writing Extraterrestrial Contact is to teach people how to determine what they're having contact with. I have devoted an entire chapter to that, another chapter to coping strategies, what to do. And if it is an extraterrestrial that, or extraterrestrials that you are having a relationship with, then what can you do in order to stand on more equal ground with them so that information can be exchanged? And that's working for a lot of people. So I think those are very important things.
Okay, well, I'm just glad you have. You're welcome to come back, and we'll cover your new book as well. I'm just glad you spend devote so much time to making these differentiations in experiences, and I'm just
scientific research for 30 years, full time.
Mhm. Yeah, I was just glad to see what you wrote about it, and so we have some of those issues that you just presented, and fact, fiction, and flying saucers also gets into some of the early government panel discussions that lead up to the more formal government efforts to debunk people. Maybe we could start with some of these, the Swedish sightings that were being observed in the late 1940s, and that's what caused America to start doing some of their panel investigations.
Yes, absolutely. Well, there was a flying disc that hovered over a military base in Germany for an entire 30 minutes, and that attracted a lot of attention. Then we had the rockets that were allegedly shot from Russia toward Sweden, but then it was discovered that the United States military was taking this very seriously, and there were prominent, very credible people who were observing flying discs. There was one case of a prominent businessman on his way to work who observed a landed flying disc with small entities outside that disc. So that was drawing a credible attention from the U.S. military. And these UFOs or flying discs were being observed by people around the world, not just in the United States. And the Army Air Force started their study, and in September of 1947, the Army Air Corps became separated from the Army and became the Air Force. And Project Sign was the first study. It was kind of a comprehensive study of the reports that they had received from members of the military pilots, military officers, and enlisted people, people who they believed had credibility. And there was a scientific team that actually studied these sightings. And in the end, there was a status report that was written that these craft were metallic. They were elliptical shaped. They had a dome on the top. They were flat on the bottom. Their flight characteristics were different from what we had observed previously. They could take off very, very quickly and could stop very quickly. They could hover in the air. And so this was very perplexing. And, of course, our military's great concern was that maybe one of our enemies had developed these craft. And so that was something that had to be watched. But in the end, they were not able to find any other country on this planet who had developed that technology. Project Sign's report was not well received by certain members of the military who did not want to believe that this could be possible. So the next project was Project Grudge, and the name will give you an indication of what happened. Instead of having a very highly qualified team, they ended up with only 2 lower-level military people, officers, who took all of Project Sign's reports and used scientists and meteorologists and tried to just assigned prosaic explanations to the well-investigated cases that they couldn't explain. That ended in 1951, and Project Blue Book emerged. And the first director of Project Blue Book was Edward Ruppelt. And under him, there was a new effort to look at this a more scientific manner and to categorize these UFO sightings and landing reports into prosaic categories such as balloons, meteorological phenomena, astronomical phenomena, hoaxes, and so on and so forth, and balloons. And in the end, they had an unknown category. That was separate from not enough insufficient information. In the unknown category, they could not categorize it as anything that we know of. And there were 26.97% of those cases, and it was more than 1,500 cases that they looked at, that were true unknowns. This drew interest from the CIA. And not only that, but also the UFOs that appeared over Washington, D.C. in 1952. And Air Force jets were scrambled to chase these UFOs. They were picked up on radar. The experienced radar operators stated that there had been temperature inversions all summer long that would cause spurious blips on the radar screen. But these experienced radar operators stated that also there were unidentified flying craft that showed up on their radar screen. And so that prompted the largest press conference that had happened since the end of World War II, held at the Pentagon. And Major General John Alexander Samford was there as the spokesperson. There were others as well. And he made the comment that they were not trying to discredit observers. He said that there were reports from credible observers of incredible things, and that there's nothing else in the work that can do these things except phenomena. Now, I had a little bit of a problem with the word phenomena, because phenomena can be anything in the sky. It can be an orb. It can be a Foo Fighter. It doesn't have to be a structured craft. He also made the statement that these objects had been observed dating back to biblical times, and there was no indication to that date that they had any intention of harming us. Well, the CIA was very, very interested at this time because so many reports were coming in, and they acquired some little over 100 reports from the Air Force. I think it was 123 reports from Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book did not know what they were going to be used for, so they didn't send the best reports that they had, unfortunately. And the CIA decided to convene a team of government scientists. There were 6 government scientists headed by Dr. H.P. Robertson. All of them had top-secret security clearances, and their job was to figure out how to handle this. They looked at some cases, and to give you an example of how they handled this, there was a case in Tremonton, Utah, in 1952, July of 1952. It happened in the middle of the day. It was video that was taken by Navy Warrant Officer Delbert Newhouse. And he was an aerial photographer for the Navy, and he had over 2,000 hours of flying time. So his wife saw these objects in the sky first. They were in fairly close, and it attracted her attention. She pointed them out to him. He was so interested that he stopped the car. He got out, and he looked at them when they were close up, and he decided that he ought to pull out his camera equipment, which is nothing like modern camera equipment. It took a while to set it up. And by the time he had it all set up and began taking video, they had moved off into the distance. But in the end, 1,600 frames were analyzed, frame by frame, at the Air Force's lab at Wright Field and the Navy's lab in Maryland. And both said that they could not identify them as balloons, aircraft, atmospheric mirages, or birds in flight. And the Air Force expended 1,000 hours to this investigation and analysis. And what happened was that the scientists came back, and one of them said, well, I've seen birds flying off the coast of California that looked like this. I don't think we should accept the Air Force and Navy's analysis. Send it back for reevaluation. And, of course, they didn't want to have the same conclusion. So that was pretty much what the Robertson panel, I believe, intended to do. So in the end, the panel members stressed the opinion that UFOs should be viewed as phenomena, such as Foo Fighters, that a debunking campaign should be undertaken to reduce the public's interest in flying saucers through television, motion pictures, and popular articles, that scientists were encouraged to debunk UFO reports through deductive reasoning. And what they wanted to do in these television shows and radio shows and motion pictures was to actually videotape credible people who had had credible sightings and then to make them look like fools through simple scientific evaluations, which were disinformation, actually, not true information. But it was a psychological campaign to reduce the public's interest in UFOs. Also, they decided that there should be surveillance of civilian UFO groups and their leaders by intelligence operatives. And this did take place, and I believe it's still taking place today.
And we go from these early panels and, just trying to, like you said, make credible witnesses look foolish, to, we start having these people who really start smear campaigns against experiencers, and that's when you start bringing in some of these, the history of certain people who seem to be pretty nefarious in UFO circles, and you start off with looking at Dr. Donald Menzel.
Yes. Donald Menzel initially just looked like a professor of physics at Harvard University. He ran the observatory, so he was an astrophysicist. And Stanton Friedman actually was very interested in Dr. Menzel because he was reputedly a member of MJ-12, the committee that the U.S. government set up after the Roswell crash. Top secret committee. And but Stanton couldn't understand why Dr. Menzel was writing books that were dismissing UFOs as all sorts of natural phenomena and misinterpretations by observers. And so Stanton ended up going to Harvard, to the library, the archival collection of Dr. Menzel. He had to get permission from Dr. Menzel's wife and from the university to do this research. He went there and started going through the files, and he found a letter written by Donald Menzel to John F. Kennedy. And the letter said, "I can tell you more when we are properly cleared to one another." And Stanton went, "What? What do you mean, properly cleared to one another? This is supposed to be just a professor of astrophysics at Harvard." And so Stanton started to dig deeper. And Dr. Menzel had left an unpublished autobiography. In that autobiography, Stanton read that he had a longer association with naval intelligence than almost anyone else, and that he was a member of the National Security Agency. So that told Stanton a lot about who Dr. Menzel really was. And as we probed deeper and deeper into his job, it appears that he was working as a paid disinformant for the U.S. government in order to debunk UFOs, and debunk them despite Project Blue Book Special Report number 14, that was the largest scientific study ever done by the Air Technical Intelligence Center at the Battelle Memorial Institute. 3,201 UFO sighting cases. And like the work that Edward Ruppelt had carried out earlier, they were divided into various categories: balloon, astronomical, aircraft, miscellaneous, psychological, insufficient information, and unknowns. And of the 3,201 cases, 21.5% were true unknowns. And a chi-square analysis was done as well, which is very rarely done, but they were really getting into a quality evaluation of these cases. And the higher the quality of the sighting, the more likely it was to be a true unknown. So Menzel was in the business of covering all of this up and trying to convince the American public that people were misinterpreting information, that it was a perceptual problem, that it was public hysteria, that people who wanted to see something and saw it because they were fantasy prone. It goes on and on. But the facts are the facts, and the facts are in the government files, and those files are in fact fiction and flying saucers. Stanton and I went to archival collections, physical archival collections, to acquire a lot of our information. And I'm very proud of that. It cost us a lot of money to go, but I think that it's important to tell the truth. If you're going to write a history book, it had better be accurate history.
And as people read this book, they will see that there are sections of it that are basically your and Stanton's autobiographies.
Yes.
And there are I just lost the page number. Where in 1968, Stanton was a presenter at the UFO symposium. So, can you tell us a little bit about that? Just keep that in mind. You just said you were at all these archives, and Stan, it was just part of this historical event.
Yes, he was. I mean, he was born in 1934, so he was a mature man back in 1968. Had been working for quite some time as a nuclear physicist, but had an interest in UFOs and had a little UFO study group that who did not criticize people who made reports to them. And Stanton wrote a paper for congressional testimony, and so he was one of the individuals who did that. And Donald Menzel was always attempting to dismiss Stanton. Stanton was presenting the facts. Donald Menzel was presenting, as I said before, anything that he could pull out of the top of his head. And this dates back all the way to before that January 1953 Robertson panel. The summer before that, Donald Menzel went to the Pentagon, and he talked to military officers there. He went in and he said, I've done a few simple experiments, and I'm writing 2 articles for magazines, and I want you to support me. I'm going to debunk UFOs as simply being atmospheric phenomena. And the military officers at the Pentagon refused to go along with him. He was extraordinarily angry, but they said, they had a serious interest at that time. Why should we have a dismissive attitude? Just write this off according to your results on one simple experiment. And so he had a very long history of being dismissive. He did not, I have noticed, really investigate the reports. He came up short time and time again as he attempted to debunk some of these reports, because he didn't have the facts in hand. And so, although he was outspoken as a government scientist, served on these symposia and conferences where he attempted to discredit UFO reports, Stanton knew who he was early on, and they did not get along together at all.
And you and Stanton wrote that there are no references in his 7-page paper that he submitted to. But that's one of the it's information like that makes fact fiction and flying saucers such compelling reading. Is okay, we get a lot of these stories that one side, the government side's presented, but you have someone like Stanton who was there.
Yeah,
it makes for a much more balanced reading. You get both sides of the story from someone like Stanton, who is a credible researcher.
Absolutely. And you can see by the references that the scientists who were truly interested in this topic, flying saucers, UFOs, and believed that it deserved scientific investigation, had references. They had done the work. But there were other scientists, such as Donald Menzel, who, again, wrote a paper, short paper, without any references. So it makes a big difference. People can say anything. A lot of people make incredible claims, but without evidence, without references, without footnotes, how can you believe what is stated?
Right, and another interesting point is on page 62. You talk about, but Dr. Menzel thought that they must come from other solar systems. An excellent cover for that notion was a strange comment in his congressional testimony that the nearest source for alien visitors must be hundreds of light years away. And then you go into the other book that you and Stanton co-authored about Betty and Barney's, Betty's star map. So that seems to be another case in your book where your autobiographical material refutes the official word.
Absolutely, and that's what American scientists have focused on. They have, for the most part, focused on a tiny area in space, maybe hundreds of light years away. But the fact is that there are 2,000 stars within 54 light years, and we now believe that I believe the last I heard it was believed that there were 1.5 planets for each star. And if you go into the volume of space that the star map that Betty Hill was shown and then sketched, and that a brilliant woman named Marjorie Fish worked on for years, going to the university, copying down distance data, evaluating the stars on Betty's map, the color, all of the characteristics of the stars, and the distance from our sun, we find that the volume of space where Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli are located, and those are the primary stars, the largest stars on the map that Betty was shown. That volume of space has loads of exoplanets. And there was recently an update that was done by an astrophysicist. And on YouTube, there is a link to that. But there's every reason to believe that there could be Earth-like planets in the Goldilocks zone around some of the stars in this volume of space.
Amazing information. Okay, and we'll come back to the star map and more about Betty and Barney in a little bit, but there's another interesting figure that you and Stanton wrote about, and that was Philip Klass and his background in UFO debunking is based on newspaper articles.
Yes, he was very attracted initially to the National Enquirer and that type of newspaper article, in order to kind of poke fun at all of this. Now, Philip Klass was not really involved in UFO investigation early on. He was a writer for Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine and one of the editors of a magazine out of Washington, D.C. And what I discovered in my research when I acquired his FBI file is that Klass was in trouble with the FBI in the early to mid-1960s. And he was under suspicion as being an operative for the Eastern European bloc. And the FBI was tailing him. He had a relationship with a young Russian man at the Soviet embassy. They did everything together, and the FBI actually searched his apartment. Philip Klass also, as a writer, had violated confidentiality by revealing classified information twice and was under suspicion for that by the FBI. The only reason that he could not be prosecuted is because they would have to present classified information in court. When this kind of thing happened, Stanton and I discovered that sometimes these people were given a choice of clearing themselves by working for the government. And we believe that is what Klass decided to do. The first book he ever read on UFOs was written by John G. Fuller. It was written in 1966, The Incident at Exeter, about a UFO sighting, close-up sighting, in Kensington, New Hampshire. And this happened in 1965, if my memory is correct. And it was observed by a man who had graduated from high school. He was just about to go into the service, and two police officers. And one of those police officers observed it at treetop level. It bathed the house in red light. And so Klass read that book, and he wrote in his book that he now knew that not all observers were kooks and cranks, as he had previously thought. And so, unfortunately, Klass went on for years giving false information, questioning the credibility of these police officers. One of them had been in the Air Force, and had worked on plane refueling. And he stated unequivocally that it was not a refueling mission, as Class first tried to, and others tried to say. Class tried to say it was only plasma on power lines, not taking into an account that it was observed at treetop level, and it was observed by more than the 2 police officers. It was observed by several people.
Okay, so and he also had a you and Stanton also wrote, Klaus waged a character assassination campaign against a third scientist, this book's co-author, Stanton T. Friedman. So, Stanton rocked the boat a number of times.
He did. You know, he was so strong, so stable, I'm trying to think of the word, so confident in his own credentials and his own abilities that he was able to argue back, to fight back against all of these things. He appeared on a television show in Canada. Right. Shortly after he moved to Canada, he was still young, and the television show host interviewed Stanton, and actually in the interview he said, have you ever been in a psychiatric hospital? Are you crazy? Unbelievable. And Stanton said, no, I have a master's and bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Chicago in physics. I worked in the field of nuclear physics in industry for 14 years, and I have his Stanton's curriculum vitae, and I can tell you that he held some pretty high-level positions in those for those companies that he worked for. Stanton was a genius. He graduated first in his class from high school at age 16, and I was furious when I listened to that video that was made, and those questions, the disrespect shown toward Stanton, but great respect shown toward a disinformant who was also on the same show. Now, Philip Klass, surreptitiously, Stanton never found out about this until late in his life, but Philip Klass had written a letter to the Hertzberg Institute of Astrophysics at the National Research Council in Ottawa, Canada. And he said, I regret to inform you, or to bring bad tidings. Let me see. I need to enlarge this so that I can read it. I have that letter in front of me. Luckily, I just pulled it out. Regarding your UFO responsibilities, but trust that like the proverbial message, I shall not be executed for doing so. He said, I have reason to believe that Canada will soon gain a noted ufologist, full-time UFO lecturer of the snake oil salesman variety, who will soon move to Canada to become its chief UFO guru. I'm not sure where he will take up residence, but I can assure you that you and your associates will be publicly accused of a UFO cover-up or cosmic cover-up, as he is prone to say, that dwarfs the Watergate scandal. So this was written in 1980. And then he went on to say his name is Stanton Friedman. He's trained in nuclear physics. He's the only nuclear physicist devoting full time to UFOs. That's how he bills himself. And that he will cause great problems for the Canadian government. And as a result of this official-looking letter from Washington, D.C., of course, from Philip Klass, they took it very seriously, and they took steps to expunge the names and addresses from their files so that Stanton and no other UFO researcher would be able to follow these reports, to talk to the witnesses. So, unfortunately, this happened. And unbelievable that he would call Stanton the ufologist of the snake oil salesman variety. He was certainly not that. Phil Klass was, but not Stanton.
No, I just when you read that passage, I jotted down. It's snake oil salesman. That's very insulting, especially for people who, like you said, their education is kind of rooted in the National Enquirer. It's really sad that the name calling got that bad.
Well, Philip Klass set up Dr. James McDonald, who Stanton had great respect for. And Dr. McDonald had been the chairman of the physics department at the University of Arizona. He became interested in the study of UFOs and then became co-chair so he could devote more time to this. He had Navy funding. He was a meteorological physicist. So he went to Australia, and he was doing meteorological physics, studying cloud formations in Australia, and at the same time, on his time off, not when he was working, on his free time, he did UFO investigations, talked to witnesses over there, acquired scientific information. Philip Klass then wrote to the Washington Post, to Jack Anderson, and he said that he had reason to believe that Dr. McDonald was inappropriately using naval research funds for UFO investigations. And the Navy actually did investigate Dr. McDonald and discovered that it was a completely above board, no problem whatsoever. But Philip Klass said, if he acquires any more funding, then I am going to take this to Congress. And the Navy didn't want to do that. So Dr. McDonald lost his funding from the Office of Naval Research, which was a terrible blow. Klass did one thing after another to him. He went to his lectures, and he always secretly recorded the statements that he made. But then, when I went to the American Philosophical Society, I found these letters that he wrote over and over again, saying, well, the recording didn't come out very well, so let me summarize for you what was stated. And when he did, he lied. Yes, he did this. He was probably the most prolific anti-UFO propagandist of the 20th century, and also the one with the lowest character level. He harmed so many people. Travis Walton, Betty and Barney Hill, the two women in Texas that I wrote about in the book, who were burned by a UFO, Betty Cash and Vicki Landrum, and also Lonnie Zamora, who in New Mexico had observed a landed craft. And he was a police officer, highly esteemed in his community. And class ended up accusing Lonnie Zamora and the mayor of perpetrating a hoax to bring tourism into the town, which was complete fiction. And there had been a scientific investigation that class completely ignored. What he did, he entered speculation and false information into every case report to confuse the American public, even to confuse ufologists, younger ufologists, who didn't know who he was or what his plan was. And that's why this book that we wrote, I think, is so important, because most people really have no idea what the true history is. And for example, in the Mutual UFO Network, I've read case reports where people have, investigators have quoted class, and not knowing that he lied. They have quoted other disinformants, which is really unfortunate when you have an investigator who's making an assessment of a case and they are quoting false information disseminated by disinformants.
Okay, and Kathleen, in your chapter 8, you just mentioned Helen and Vicky. That was a really interesting case, and you and Stanton wrote that Betty was never able to lead a normal life again. Her injuries were permanent and debilitating. I mean, this was just like a one-time exposure. I mean, there's got to be something, a scientific explanation for such a dramatic turnaround in health. And you just mentioned class and other authorities just really did all they could to debunk them.
Absolutely. Betty, well, the women, let me give the audience a little, or listeners, a little bit of background information. If they're not familiar with the book, goes into great detail. But this was also a case that was investigated by John Schuessler from the Mutual UFO Network. And I was able to get a lot of really good information from John, who he's a retired engineer for, I believe it was NASA. And the women had gone out for an evening out. Vicki Landrum had her little grandson with her. They were returning home because they couldn't find things open. It was just after Christmas time. And so they were returning through kind of a rural area in East Texas, north of Houston, when they saw this craft that seemed to be kind of putting out molten metal and that's the way it looked. And it was hovering over the road, so they had to stop the car. They couldn't get around this. And so Betty Cash, who was the driver, got out of the car and stood in front of it and looked at this. Vicky's grandson was frightened, so she stayed in the car to push him down so that he wouldn't be looking at it, but she was looking at it from inside the car now and then also as she was trying to comfort her grandson. And this craft was so hot that when Betty Cash went to open the door handle was too hot to touch. She had to put material over her hand just to open the door of the car. Vicki leaned forward and put her hand on the dashboard, and it left a permanent indentation in the plastic on the dashboard. That's how hot it was. They went home. On the way, they saw what appeared to be military helicopters escorting this highly unusual craft, no wings or anything like that. And the next day, Betty Cash's face was so swollen and so burned that she ended up in the hospital. And she stayed in the hospital for a very long period of time, suffering from radiation sickness, suffering from radiation burns. She lost hair, and it was so debilitating that she wasn't able to work again. Vicki, who was inside the car, had some radiation burns too, lost a little hair, but not like Betty Cash, who was standing outside, being directly exposed to that craft. And Philip Klass and his cohorts actually accused Betty Cash of laying a template down on her arm and burning herself intentionally to attract attention. That's the kind of people we're dealing with. And one of them was a medical doctor, which is just incredible, who accused her of having Munchausen syndrome. But this is the kind of work that they were engaged in. And so you can read all of the details in Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. That's just one example of several of the very compelling best evidence cases that were investigated thoroughly by top-notch investigators. The evidence was collected and analyzed. They were exposed to ionizing radiation, and all of it was dismissed.
And you mentioned that Vicki and Helen were accused diagnosed with having Munchausen syndrome.
Yes.
And you also say, does he also believe that Vicki burned her own flesh and then inflicted wounds upon her grandson? Child Protective Services would have been there, but they weren't prosecuted for hurting and intentionally hurting their grandson or her grandson. So, what was said about them really doesn't go anywhere else. It's just.
But the American public was disinformed. The American public believes that this never happened, that these women were attention seekers and mentally ill on top of it.
Yeah. And we could take that case and segue into your friend Travis Walton's harrowing ordeal, and there's another. You have a photo of you, Stanton, and Travis. You know him. It seems like you know him really well. The three of you used to appear at all those conferences. You present Travis in a very likable way in the several pages where you cover him. What's Travis like? Behind the scenes and talking with him on the phone, or what?
Well,
is he a believable person?
Travis has been to my house, spent 5 days or a week with us, He was here to speak at to a UFO group. I've known Travis for many years. I spoke to Dr. James Harder, who was one of the original UFO abduction investigators who investigated that case and hypnotized Travis. I have all of the reports on Travis's the investigation, including Philip Klass's investigation of this and debunking campaign. I can tell you that Travis is the salt of the earth. He's a nice gentleman. He enjoys his music. He enjoys people. He was traumatized by what occurred for many, many years. It used to hurt me to see him, to be able to observe the traumatic stress that he was holding in his body. And he did, in recent years, overcome that, which was a really good thing to see. But he thought for years that had been abused, that they had harmed him and abducted him for he didn't know what reason. And, of course, all of the early UFO investigators, the UFO abduction investigators, had kind of a negative take on all of this, too. So he came up having his event early on with this kind of attitude being expressed by investigators. But James Harder, Dr. James Harder, told me fairly early on that, and my Aunt Betty Hill, I was at Betty's house and he was there, that he didn't go into a lot of hypnosis with Travis because he thought that he had been inadvertently harmed when the beam from the craft hit him. Well, what we know now is that beam that he described and the crew who were in the truck and observed this happening, when that beam hit him, he was thrown back. There had to have been a malfunction, a mistake made, and instead of drawing him to the craft, he was thrown back very hard on the ground. And Travis came to realize that they didn't have to pick him up. They could have left him there seriously injured. But they didn't. They picked him up. They took him up to the craft. They did everything they could to repair the damage that was done to Travis. And yes, they kept him for 5 days, probably because he would have spent 5 days in the hospital otherwise. And how could they take him to the hospital and drop him off? So they took care of him. And I've been to the area, to the site where he was abducted. I've walked on that site. I know what it's like. I've talked to Mike Rogers, who he worked for. I've talked to another one of the men, the youngest member of the crew, who was there and witnessed this, who told me that Philip Klass offered him $10,000 if he'd be willing to lie and say that it was all a hoax. And read Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. You'll find out what the truth is, what the facts are, and what Philip Klass did to Travis to attempt to destroy his reputation, to impugn his character, and it was done very, very unfairly. He tried to make Travis look like a criminal and a hoaxer and a person who injected LSD. Get that, injected LSD. He thought that Travis was hiding out in a camp, that he had just walked to this camp by a ranch and was hiding out in there and apparently had a hypodermic needle and injected LSD. And that's why there was a puncture wound at the bend of his arm, he didn't consider the idea that that puncture wound might have been made by these human-looking entities. There were a group of humans on that craft, human-looking entities, not completely human, and there were also a group of a variety of grays. They were sort of whitish in complexion, but had a lot of the characteristics that grays have. And so that the group, the human group or the gray group, who treated him could have given him a shot, could have put him on fluids, could have done any of a number of things to treat him. Or he might have just been stabbed by the limb of a tree because he was out in the national forest with a work crew, and what they were doing is cleaning up the debris after a logging job. You know, so you can get punctured quite easily doing that kind of work. And it's all in the book. But, you know, nasty things have been done to impugn the character, the credibility, the mental health of these individuals. Unfortunately, that's why I'm an experiencer advocate, because I'm just sick of it. And when I realized what was actually happening and how many people were being harmed by these disinformants and how their lives were being ruined, how people like Philip Klass did all they could to try to get these people fired from their jobs, to put them into a position where they would never be able to work in their field again, whether they were scientists or UFO abduction experiencers.
And Kathleen, you do mention that you had moved in with your Aunt Betty, and it'd probably be better just to have you tell. Yeah, I mean, that's a criminal act right there with someone in the house. I mean, you've experienced this, the efforts to really cause psychological damage to people. It's terrible. Just go ahead and tell the story.
Okay. Well, my Uncle Barney died in February of 1969 at age 46 from a massive cerebral hemorrhage. And so Betty was left alone. And when she was left alone, these individuals from the intelligence community or whoever they were stepped up their plan to completely discredit Betty. And so they were, when Barney was alive, they had pulled off a few things that would cause Betty and Barney to feel threatened, to be intimidated, to these weird things that were being done. And after Barney died, this ramped up, and Betty's house was being entered. She one day returned home from work, and there on her living room floor was a pile of clothing, but from the closet, with Barney's scarf laying over the top of that pile of clothing. She always left her alarm clock set at the same time. She was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire, so she would get up at the same time every morning. So somebody reset the alarm clock to wake her up in the middle of the night. Somebody went in and turned the heat up as high as it would go. So Betty asked my first husband and I to move in. We were both college students at the time, about ready to graduate. And we lived in an apartment she had just below her. Ours was the basement apartment. She had a home with 4 apartments in it. Hers was the largest. She occupied the entire first floor. And so one day I was there, and I was commuting back and forth to the University of New Hampshire, and I was studying on my bed in my apartment when I thought I heard Betty enter the house. And it was unusual for her to come home at noontime, but I thought, oh, gee, maybe she's come home and to have lunch or pick something up. So I went up the stairs to greet her because we had a very close relationship. And so I did have an intercom between her apartment and mine, so we could overhear what was going on. And so I went up the stairs. We always left the door unlocked between our 2 apartments. The others were deadbolt locked. And looked for Betty, called for her, couldn't find her. So I went back downstairs, and all of a sudden I heard a loud crashing sound. And I went running up the stairs. I thought, oh, my gosh, what has happened? And there was a closet door that was wide open, a baseball bat on the floor in front of that. It was Betty's bat and glove that she had in her closet. The front door was open, and I went dashing. I was, young and pretty speedy at that time. I went dashing down the hallway, out the front door, and there was a man dressed in a brown suit running away from Betty's house and getting into a car and speeding off. I mean, that was not a common burglar. That was an intelligence agent who had a job to do. That's my interpretation of it. And he was just pulling off these tricks, I think, to try to push Betty over the edge. Here she had just lost her husband, the major support in her life after the 2 of them had been abducted together. And this program was ramped up. And Betty, I have to tell you, like Stanton, was extremely intelligent and a very strong, well-grounded individual. If she wasn't, I'm sure she would have gone over the edge. But instead of doing that, she didn't tell people in the UFO community. She didn't make it public. She told the police. And she ended up getting one of the early alarm security systems and had that installed in her home and wired into the police department. It happened again, but it was the last time that it happened after the alarm sounded. But her phone was tapped. We know that. There were other people who testified that they were aware that her phone was tapped. So she was under surveillance, and she was attempting to be discredited over and over and over again. That's what she had to live with. And she and Barney had never even gone public with their story. They had intended for it to remain confidential. They reported it to the Air Force, Project Blue Book. They reported it to the National Investigations Committee on aerial phenomena. But it was a violation of confidentiality, carried their story to the public when a newspaper reporter from the Boston Traveler got wind of it and interviewed officers at Pease Air Force Base, also interviewed a dozen witnesses to the UFO that night that Betty and Barney had their event, and interviewed people who knew Betty, who didn't realize that she had not given her permission, and so they just spilled the beans to this newspaper reporter, and he had articles that ran for 5 days in a row in late October of 1965. So that's what caused that story to go public. And, then Betty and Barney had to suffer. And they suffered terribly. Their major interest was in improving the lives of the citizens of New Hampshire. They had been on the board that set up the Rockingham County Community Action Program with the poverty programs from the federal government. Barney had been awarded an award by Sergeant Shriver and the governor of New Hampshire and the man from the Office of Economic Opportunity. Barney had been appointed to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission State Advisory Committee. That was another very prominent position that he held in the state of New Hampshire. And he and Betty certainly would never go with their story, with the very important positions they held, and with their interest in forwarding the civil rights movement and forwarding human rights as well. That was their focus. That's what they were doing in their lives. They were not people who were at all interested in UFOs. Even though my mother had a close-up sighting back in 1957, 58, something like that. But Barney was a disbeliever. He was not willing to believe that before he actually saw the craft with the non-humans on it and had conscious recall for it, he didn't even believe that it was possible. Betty thought it might be possible, but she wasn't certain. But after they had that event, as I said, they were committed to talking to UFO investigators, to Air Force officers and naval officers as well, to scientists. But they entered the family and close friends and members of their church group. But they definitely did not want this story to be carried to the public on a widespread scale. But it was.
Okay, and I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead and finish.
No, I just said, but it was. So go ahead. That was a very short sentence.
Okay. Just to let the audience know that you have a revised, expanded edition of Captured that will be out next spring. Is that correct?
That is correct. And, since I wrote Captured, and Stanton wrote part of the book too, I have been attempting to have other materials scientifically analyzed in scientific laboratories, and there has been a lot of additional information that has come forward. And all of that information is going to be revealed in this new updated version of Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, the second edition. You can get the first edition from me or from Barnes & Noble or Amazon now. My website is KATHLEEN-MARDEN, MARDEN.com, and all of my books, autographed copies, are for sale on my website. So you have a lot of different options. If you go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, there are audiobooks, ebooks, hardcover, softcover, you name it. All of my books are in various formats.
Okay. Well, you are welcome to return to cover the expanded edition of Captured. Love to have you come back.
Okay, but I can only tell a little bit of what the new scientific evidence is. I'm not going to spill the beans on all of it. But thank you for inviting me. I would love to come.
I'm just saying you already have an invitation. Just we'll put you down sometime in April.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
I've just really enjoyed I've been talking for about 90 minutes, and it seems like about 15 minutes. I just step back and let you tell these stories. Your books are terrific, and the teamwork that you and Stanton put into these books and expressing your experiences of just the attacks, what you were just talking about with people being in the house. They weren't invited. They got into the house and are doing. It's a really visceral type story. It's immoral, illegal. It's really a captivating book. It's very well done.
Thank you so much. And I think it's very readable, too, because what we always attempt to do in our books is just to tell a good story with the facts and with the footnotes and with the references so that you know where we got those facts from.
Mm-hmm. And so with all these examples that we've covered over the last 90 minutes, why is there such a need to discredit people involved in the UFO movement?
Well, I have found there's a difference between UFOs and contact with extraterrestrial beings. We have soft disclosure coming forward now. The Department of Defense has admitted that the Tic Tac video and the videos off the East Coast as well were official Navy radar video. So they've admitted that. So we're having some soft disclosure that's taking place, but no disclosure regarding contact, direct contact between non-humans and humans. And I've talked to military officers, actually, and even some people in the intelligence community about this. And my speculation was that humans are being taken sometimes against their will. And they're undergoing these medical procedures, examinations, and our military, no military on the entire planet is capable of preventing this from happening. And that poses a huge threat because their job is to is the orderly functioning of the body politic, to maintain order among the population. You don't want hysteria. And you might have a lot more frightened people if the facts about alien abduction are brought forth by credible individuals. And I think that is one of the big problems that those of us in this field have experienced. I've been threatened too, but also I've had military officers and intelligence agents tell me that I'm correct in that assumption that I just voiced, that's what it is, that they cannot protect us. So a UFO is fine. It's good to look at. It's good to study. Maybe we can develop that kind of technology or learn their scientific secrets. But when it comes to what occupies the craft, what flies that craft, they want nothing to do with that.
Okay, and maybe we can stop with the review of fact fiction and flying saucers there, and just spend a little bit of time covering your co-authored book, The Alien Abduction Files, with Denise Stoner. And since you also have a background in social work, how did you and Denise start talking? She's telling you about her story. When someone is telling you about her fantastic tale, how do you? What do you do? Just listen. How do you ask questions to have the speaker give you more information? And we can get into Denise's story as well.
Okay, sure. Well, let me say first that my husband and I had left New Hampshire. We were growing older and tired of the cold weather, and we moved to Florida, where Denise lived. And I decided to become involved in Florida MUFON, and I already had a reputation, so I was very well known. So Denise was state section director in the Mutual UFO Network. She was the chief investigator. She was a member of the STAR team, which is the elite team of investigators for MUFON. And she was holding a meeting, and I decided just to go to the meeting. And she recognized me. And she didn't want to introduce me because she didn't know if I wanted to be recognized or not. But we talked a little bit. And then she invited me to her home for lunch one day. And so I decided to go. And over lunch, she said, I'm an experiencer. I've been abducted from, I had a major abduction back in 1981, 82. And so I was very interested in hearing her story and what she remembered about it. So what I do when I interview people is I generally let them talk. And what I'm looking for is consistency in what they say, how much information they have, were there witnesses? Well, Denise had witnesses as well. And so that was very important. Is there missing time? I want to know. And, of course, Denise was an investigator, a highly ranked investigator. So she knew everything that I was looking for anyway. So this one was quite easy, that, they were going to their summer camp, living in Colorado near Denver at the time, left the same time every Friday night. They'd drive down to Buena Vista and meet Denise's parents and family friends, and Denise's mother would have dinner for them. They worked like clockwork because they knew they had to be there before 8 o'clock for dinner. So on that particular night, they're driving along. They're coming off from a 12,000-foot pass, Kenosha Pass, and as they're driving down to the valley floor, they see two new lights in the sky that are weaving around erratically. and approaching them. And so they're watching these lights. And finally, they've driven down to the valley floor, and these lights come straight at their vehicle. And Denise had conscious memory of feeling as if the car was sliding off the side of the road. And her husband was driving, and she said she remembered that she was speaking to him. Do you see that? Look at that. What is that? But he had both hands on the steering wheel, and he was staring straight ahead. Well, I thought, oh, gee, well, maybe there's a prosaic explanation for this. Maybe they did go off the road. Maybe they were knocked unconscious or lost consciousness, and that could explain what occurred. And so, after she finished talking, or sometimes even during the conversation, if I could interject a question, I would say, give the question, do you think that you might have just gone off the side of the road and you were unconscious and that's what happened? And she'd say, no, that isn't what happened, because our next memory was of being 40 miles south of our previous location. And instead of being daylight, like it was when they saw these craft coming toward the car, it was now dark. Their car was stopped. It was at the top of Trout Creek Pass. And it was, by the time they arrived at their camp, it was 11 o'clock at night. They were supposed to be there at 8 o'clock. They had no prosaic explanation for what had happened to them. So I had Denise's testimony of what she remembered and recorded, notes taken, and had a really good idea of what happened. She didn't remember the date. She knew what they were driving and that sort of thing. But then I separately interviewed Denise's husband, and I interviewed Denise's mother. So her mother actually gave me a sworn statement that Denise and Ed had arrived that late, that they were so worried that they had had an accident or their car had broken down that they were going to go to the ranch house, and which was the office, and asked to use the phone to call the highway patrol to report their absence. When Ed and Denise showed up, and they told them about the UFOs that they saw and how they had missed these 40 miles that should have registered on the odometer but didn't, and all of these other things. And Denise's parents just laughed. They thought that Ed and Denise were kidding. They were pulling their leg, that they just decided to go later. But that was not what had happened. So then, after I had the entire story, everything that they remembered consciously, I wanted to know if they'd made a report. No, they had not made a report. Denise had gone for hypnosis when she lived in Denver, but she had forgotten everything that she had said under hypnosis. When she went back to try to get the transcripts, the hypnotist was deceased and all of his files had been disposed of. So there was no help there. So I decided that I would hypnotize Ed and Denise separately and reinstate amnesia. So they, just like Dr. Benjamin Simon did with my aunt and uncle Betty and Barney Hill. And the reason for that was so that they couldn't contaminate one another's information. I wanted separate witnesses who were giving me detailed, hopefully, information so that I could check the story out. I always looked for any hole, any prosaic explanation, ordinary explanation, maybe a mistake. I knew it wasn't a hoax. And so that's what I did. And I did hypnotize them separately and was able to acquire a lot more information, even the date and the day of the week that this happened and the year. And so then I went on to my computer and I looked through the files dating back to that date, the archives, and discovered that, yes, it did happen on Friday the 13th of August, just as Denise recalled under hypnosis. So there was one little fact. And then I kept looking for other facts, comparing it to what I knew about other abductions and piecing it together a little bit at a time, checking out Denise's credibility, checking to see if she was fantasy prone, looking for prosaic explanations all along and accepting and writing about what I could not refute. And I wrote a little bit about what I questioned as well, because she went back later, much, much later after this investigation. And I hadn't known this previously, but she thought that she had been abducted from the time she was 2.5 years old. And she had this clear memory of looking out the window of her home. Her grandparents and her parents all lived together in the home. Her mother was in the hospital giving birth to her younger sister. Her father was out that night. She was alone with the grandfather. She's looking out the window, and she thinks she sees Humpty Dumpty in the sky. So she calls her grandfather. It wasn't Humpty Dumpty. It was a big oval light, fairly close up. The grandfather looked out, and he said, "No, that's not Humpty Dumpty," and he closed the curtains. And Denise believed that she was taken that night when she was 2.5 years old. Well, I've studied child development, child psychology. I have a background, a good, strong background in the social sciences. And I know for a fact that 2.5-year-old children are fantasy prone. And that perhaps this didn't really happen. I question that. Maybe it did, because my research shows that about 37% of experiencers believe that they were taken when they were less than 5 years old for the first time. So there's the possibility that it's real. But I know that I have to be skeptical about stories, detailed stories that come from people dating back to their early childhood years. There are many other plausible explanations. But there was no other plausible explanation for this very major event that Denise and Ed had, and another event, too, that I wrote about in the book, that they both had when they were returning home after a weekend of skin diving. It was Sunday morning. They went diving. They were cave divers, and went diving on Saturday and spent the night at a motel. And Denise's mother was babysitting their daughter, and so they had to leave in the morning to go home and collect their daughter. And some people had said, "Oh, they probably had, they were skin diving. They breathed in nitrogen," and so trying to dismiss it. It doesn't last in their system 16, 18 hours. They had another event. It was about a 2-hour event when they were on one road, and then they found themselves in a completely different location on another road, and time had passed. And you can read about all of that in the Alien Abduction Files, as well as 5 other cases that I've personally investigated that I thought were compelling evidence cases, and I did the hypnosis sessions with some of those individuals as well.
Yeah, Kathleen, your case studies are fascinating. You get a few sample diagrams. The one of Jenny's sketch with the fetuses in the tanks. That's just something. It seems like it's something right out of the X-Files. But that seems like some kind of dreamlike fantasy type scenario. It's just it has some really creepy images to it.
Yes, and it could be. I'm not saying that I'm 100% convinced that is what she observed on this craft, but other people have reported the same thing. You have to remember, though, that Bud Hopkins wrote about this. David Jacobs wrote about this as well. So, maybe the memory has been contaminated by that knowledge that they had acquired.
Maybe it wasn't.
They read or observed. But I can't prove one way or the other if that part of it is true. I do know that there is evidence that I have observed, such as electromagnetic anomalies in the home. Other things. Betty's son, Jenny's son, is an adult now. He is still having episodes as well. And so there are some things as an investigator and researcher that I can find evidence for. There are other things that I can't. But I also, something that we look for is we have knowledge that the general public doesn't have knowledge of. Things from descriptions of certain procedures, detailed procedures on craft, marks, patterned marks on experiencers' bodies that have not been published. We try to keep that secret. I have an entire catalog of these patterned marks that are just showing up on experiencers' bodies around the world. It doesn't matter if you're in Brazil or France or Quebec, Canada, or Kentucky. People are having these same marks put on their bodies.
Wow.
And so I have to use the secret information that I have as well.
Okay. So that's just some more proof. How do people who don't know each other, living thousands of miles apart, have the same marks on them?
Yes,
like
and
who's putting them there?
I'm not talking about a simple little scoop mark that Bud Hopkins used to talk about. These are patterned, detailed marks.
Right.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. It's these as Barbara and I do our shows, and guests come on and talk about whatever they're researching. The importance of patterns just keeps reappearing as something that really needs to be given a lot more credibility.
Mm-hmm.
That's just nothing. Yeah, and Kathleen, we're down to about the last 4 minutes or 4 minutes of the show. Is there anything you want to? Hopefully, there'll be some appearances coming up. Hopefully, this virus situation is going to end soon. But do you have any appearances coming up, or do you want to just plug your website again?
Yes, well, actually, there's going to be a free online conference. You can do an internet search for Portal to Ascension. And this is taking place, I think it's out in California, but it's entirely online and it's absolutely free. So I can actually post that link on my website tomorrow. And also I'll put it on my Facebook page for people who are my Facebook friends. So if anyone's interested in that, I have an interview on that on Sunday at Sunday, October 4th, and it's going to be from 6:20 to 7 o'clock Eastern Time, and then I'm going to be on a panel discussion after that on UFOs. So that's something that's coming up very soon. All of our in-person appearances have been canceled due to the virus, of course. Hoping that we're going to be able to do some of that next year. But I have a lot of articles on my website that you can go to read. They're all free. So, again, my website is Kathleen, KATHLEEN, -Marden, MARDEN.com. And, again, my 5 books and one of Stanton Friedman's books that he wrote without me are all being offered for sale, autographed copies by Stanton as well on my website. So I'd be happy to send out any orders that I receive, go down to the post office and mail them to you right away. And so on my website, too, if you want to check from time to time, I update my blog, and I will be posting the lectures and appearances that I will be making when I know for certain what's going on in 2021.
Okay. Well, save a date in April 2021 for you to return to cover the expanded captured book. And,
okay.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. We're down to the last couple seconds, and this was a lot of fun. It was great talking with you again, and I just hope we can get you back on to review more of your fascinating books.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that all of your listeners did as well.
Yeah, I hope so. So thank you again. Thanks, Barbara, for producing, and I'll see everyone next Tuesday with kicking off our Halloween month. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great night, and thank you again, Kathleen.